The first time I agreed to go hunting with Jake, I knew it wasn't about the deer or the woods. It was about him. He'd been asking me for years, always saying I needed to get out of the city, that I spent too much time overthinking everything. Maybe he was right. I'd never touched a rifle in my life, but there I was, bumping along in his old truck down a gravel road, heading deeper into the middle of nowhere, just to spend a weekend in the freezing woods with the guy I'd been quietly in love with since college. Jake looked like he belonged out here. Flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, calloused hands, that easy swagger that said he'd been hunting since he could walk. Everything about him was rugged and grounded like the earth itself. I, on the other hand, was layered in new gear that still smelled like the store. He teased me for it, of course, called me a city slicker, and laughed when I tried to pretend I wasn't freezing. We reached the clearing just before sunset. It was quiet. No cars, no cell service, just trees that stretched up forever, and the sound of wind moving through the branches. The tent we set up was barely big enough for 2 people, and Jake casually mentioned that nights would drop below freezing. "Hope you don't mind sharing body heat," he joked, throwing me a wink. I laughed, playing it off like it was nothing, but my heart flipped a little. That was Jake, always touching, always close. A hand on my back when I stepped over a fallen log, brushing pine needles out of my hair, our shoulders bumping as we sat by the fire. Maybe it was just how he was. But sometimes he looked at me for just a second too long. And I'd look away, pretending I hadn't noticed. I never planned to tell him how I felt. It was easier to just keep it locked up somewhere deep, where it couldn't ruin anything. He was straight, masculine, sure of himself. I was just the quiet best friend who'd follow him to the ends of the earth if he asked. And now here we were, 2 sleeping bags zipped into one, the wilderness around us, and a silence between us thick enough to set fire to. We met during freshman year of college. I remember it like a movie scene, me, sitting alone at a crowded orientation event, pretending to be deeply invested in the campus map, and Jake plopping down next to me with a smirk and a bag of chips. "You look like you're about to drop out before classes even start," he said. I laughed, mostly out of nerves, and just like that, he stuck. Jake wasn't like the guys I'd grown up around. He was loud, unapologetic, and carried this calm, magnetic confidence that made people naturally gravitate toward him. I was quieter, more observant. I liked to watch people before I spoke to them. Jake didn't wait. He just decided I was going to be his friend, and that was that. We ended up as roommates our sophomore year. That's when things got complicated. The first time I noticed it, really noticed it, was one late night after a party. He was drunk, laughing, stumbling around our apartment while I tried to guide him to bed. He collapsed onto the couch instead, dragged me down with him, and just laid there with his head on my chest, breathing slow. "You're the only person who gets me," he mumbled, voice barely above a whisper. I laid there frozen, heart pounding, staring up at the ceiling and trying not to read into it. But I did. I always did. There were other moments like that. Times he'd knock on my door in the middle of the night just to talk, or when we'd go out and he'd walk a little closer to me when some drunk guy stared too long. He'd put an arm around my shoulder, joke, "This one's mine," and laugh like it meant nothing, but it meant something to me. Every touch lingered longer than it should have. Every glance made me wonder. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Jake dated girls, mostly casually, never anything serious. He'd talk about them like they were background noise. I watched them come and go, always with that ache in my chest, always smiling through it. There was one night during our senior year I almost told him. We were sitting on the roof of our building, drinking cheap whiskey, the city lights glowing around us. He said, "I don't think I'd be here without you." I looked at him, the words in my throat, burning, but I swallowed them. Because I didn't want to lose what we had. Whatever it was, it felt real, safe, sacred. I never told him. Not then, not ever. I became good at tucking it all away. My feelings, the what-ifs, the hopes I never admitted even to myself. Still, somewhere deep down, I always wondered if he knew. And maybe he did. The sun was barely up when Jake woke me, already, lacing his boots, looking like some action movie hero with his thermal jacket and camo gear. He tossed me a protein bar and a wink. "Hope you slept, 'cause we've got a long day ahead of us." The trail was rugged and steep, with frost clinging to the leaves and our breath visible in the early morning cold. I wasn't used to terrain like this, and Jake, annoyingly graceful as always, moved like he was born in the wild. Every now and then, he'd reach back to help me over a rock or steep patch, his hand rough and warm in mine. It was nothing, probably instinct for him, but I felt every touch like it meant something more. I always did. We moved in silence sometimes, just the crunch of boots on frost-bitten leaves and the occasional call of birds overhead. Other times he'd talk, tell stories about hunting trips with his dad when he was a kid, or that time he almost got chased by a buck with an attitude. He was in his element here. I was just grateful to be beside him, watching the sunlight filter through the trees and hit his face at perfect angles. When we finally stopped to rest, he pulled out a flask and handed it to me. "Liquid courage," he said with a grin. It was whiskey, warm, sharp, biting. We passed it back and forth, sitting on a log, the quiet wrapping around us like a blanket. That's when he brought her up. "Remember Tara?" he asked, and I stiffened without meaning to. "From junior year?" I nodded. Of course I remembered. Blonde, loud laugh, always hanging on his arm like she was clinging to something more permanent. "She messaged me last week," he said, chuckling. "Said she saw one of my hunting pics and missed the wild man." He made air quotes. "Crazy, right?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Crazy." He didn't notice the way my voice dropped, or maybe he did and pretended not to. Either way, I stared at the fire we'd built and tried to quiet the sick twist in my stomach. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something deeper. A reminder that no matter how close we were, there was a part of him I could never reach. A version of his future I wasn't in. As night settled in, the temperature dropped fast. We sat close by the fire, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in thick jackets, watching the embers dance. Jake handed me a tin cup of something hot, and when our fingers touched, I didn't pull away immediately. Neither did he. "You good?" he asked, nudging me lightly. "Yeah," I said, voice low. "This is nice, peaceful," he smiled. "Told you you'd like it." Later, inside the tent, it was colder than I expected. We laid our sleeping bags out side by side, but Jake looked at me like it wasn't up for debate. "Zip in them. Together. Otherwise, one of us is waking up a popsicle." I laughed, trying to seem unaffected, while my heart scrambled in my chest. We slid inside, awkwardly close, our arms accidentally brushing, his knee nudging mine. "Night, man," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. I replied, eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the tent wall, trying not to feel too much. But I did. I always did. The tent was smaller than I remembered it looking in the daylight. Once the sleeping bags were zipped together and both of us were inside, there was barely an inch of space between us, just body heat and layers of thermal fabric. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the thin walls like they might give out any second. My nose was already cold, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. Still, inside the cocoon of nylon and shared warmth, it felt safe. Jake shifted beside me, his arm brushing mine as he pulled the sleeping bag tighter around his chest. "This thing's like a damn straitjacket," he mumbled, wriggling dramatically. I snorted. "You insisted on the two-man setup." He nudged me with his elbow. "That's because I knew you'd freeze alone." Before I could respond, he turned toward me and suddenly jabbed his fingers into my ribs. I yelped, instinctively twisting away, but there was nowhere to go. He was grinning in the dim light, eyes gleaming with mischief. "You're ticklish?" he asked. "Don't." "Oh, it's over for you now," he laughed, launching another quick jab. We ended up tangled, wrestling under the tight confines of the sleeping bag, limbs pressing and twisting, the warmth between us suddenly too much. At one point, he had his arm pinned around my waist, his face inches from mine, both of us out of breath and laughing softly. Then it faded. The laughter, the motion. And we just laid there, still. His leg rested against mine. Our arms touched from wrist to elbow. And even though I didn't dare move, my entire body was screaming with awareness. I could feel the exact curve of his shoulder through the fabric of his shirt, the heat radiating off his chest, the way his breathing slowed and matched mine. Didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe too loud. I wanted to memorize it, the feel of being close to him without fear, without pretending it didn't mean something. I wanted to stay in that moment forever, where it was dark and quiet, and we didn't have to talk about what we were or weren't. "Hey," he said suddenly, voice low. I swallowed. "Yeah?" "You ever think about how weird it is we've never dated anyone?" His voice was casual, like he was thinking out loud, but the question punched through me like a bullet. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he murmured. We've known each other forever. People probably thought we were a couple at some point." My heart thudded painfully. "Maybe," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Does that bother you?" There was a pause. Then he laughed softly, turning onto his back. "Nah, just funny, I guess." He didn't say anything else, and neither did I. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, staring at the curve of the tent's ceiling and wondering what he meant, and if he even knew. The next morning, Jake was quiet. He handed me a mug of coffee without saying much, eyes fixed on the fire like it had said something he was trying to process. We packed up our gear in silence and started hiking deeper into the woods, the trail crunching under our boots, a blanket of frost covering everything like the forest had paused overnight. It was supposed to be a longer hunt, but neither of us seemed all that focused. Jake moved slower than usual, distracted, barely reacting when we startled a deer too far off to shoot. He kept stopping to adjust his pack, looking out into the trees like he was searching for something he couldn't name. I walked behind him most of the time, watching the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed, like he was thinking too hard. There were moments, though, that made my head spin. When I was fumbling with my jacket zipper, he stepped in without a word, took hold of the metal pull and zipped it for me, his fingers brushing my chest longer than they needed to. Another time, as we sat on a log eating jerky and trail mix, he reached out and wiped something off my cheek, dirt or ash, I wasn't sure, and his thumb lingered just a beat too long. My brain wouldn't shut up. I kept telling myself not to. Read into it. That it didn't mean anything. That I was just hungry, tired, touch-starved. But the way he kept stealing glances, the way his body seemed to angle toward mine when we stood still, it felt like something was happening. And it terrified me. Later, when the sun began to dip and the air turned sharp again, we settled near a creek to rest. Jake skipped stones across the surface, each one hitting the water with a hollow plunk. I watched his face, the way his jaw clenched and relaxed, his eyes flicking up to mine before looking away again. He spoke suddenly. "What would you do if a guy liked you?" I blinked. "What?" Jake shrugged, kept throwing stones. "Like, just hypothetically, if a guy told you he liked you, what would you say?" My throat tightened. "Is this about you or someone else?" He gave a little half-laugh. "Someone else." I looked away, heart pounding. "I guess it depends. If I liked him back, I'd probably say something. But if I wasn't sure what he wanted, or if I thought I was just a experiment to him, I'd probably keep my guard up. Jake was quiet. The water kept rippling from the stones. "So, honesty," he said finally. "That's what you'd want." "Yeah," I said, softer now. "Even if it's messy. I'd rather know the truth than be left guessing." He didn't respond. Just stood there, looking down at the creek like it had the answer he couldn't find in me. The second night was colder than the first by far. The kind of cold that crept through the seams of the tent and settled in your bones no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself in layers. Jake and I had eaten quietly by the fire, a quietness that felt thicker than the silence between trees. Something had shifted during the day, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just wishful thinking hanging heavy in my chest. He didn't bring up his strange question from earlier, and I didn't press. We both seemed content, pretending nothing had changed. But I felt it. The weight of something unspoken, stretching out between us like a taut wire, ready to snap or sing. When we finally crawled into the sleeping bag again, he didn't crack a joke or make a big show of our closeness. He just laid down next to me, facing the opposite way. I stared at the curve of his back for a long time, listening to the wind outside and the soft rhythm of his breath. My body ached from the hike, but my chest ached worse. I was too tired to keep thinking, too raw to keep hoping. So I let my eyes fall closed, letting the hum of the wind and Jake's steady breathing lull me into a fragile kind of sleep. A sleep wrapped in both peace and heartbreak. The kind you learn to live with when someone you love is just out of reach. I don't know how long I was out before I woke again. Something soft pulled me back, familiar warmth, a slight pressure on my side. I blinked slowly, adjusting to the dark. Jake was pressed against me. His arm was draped over my middle, his hand resting gently on my stomach like it had always belonged there. Not tight, not forceful. Just there. Steady. Real. His breath tickled the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribs, confusion and longing flooding in so fast I almost forgot how to breathe. I thought maybe it was just instinct, sleep-drifted closeness, nothing intentional. But then, softly, almost too quietly to hear, he whispered, "You awake?" I froze. "Yeah," I whispered back. A pause. Then, "I keep thinking about today, about what you said." My mouth was dry. About what part? Another beat of silence. Then, the honesty, wanting to know, even if it's messy. I turned, slightly, enough to glance at him over my shoulder. His eyes were open, watching me in the darkness, and his face looked like it had no defenses left. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, voice thick with something fragile. "I've never thought about a guy like this, but with you I don't know. It's been in my head for a long time, and I can't stop thinking about it." I didn't speak. I couldn't. "I didn't mean to touch you," he added. "But when I woke up like this, it felt right, and I wanted to." He reached up slowly, uncertainly, and touched my cheek. Just a brush of his knuckles. My skin burned under it. "I don't know what this means," he whispered, voice trembling. "But I think about you. I've thought about you for a long time, and I don't know how to make it stop. And maybe I don't want to." I stared at him. My heart felt too big for my chest. "You're not a mistake to me," I said, my voice barely holding. "But I need to know this isn't just a moment you'll regret tomorrow. I've felt this way for so long, Jake. And I didn't say anything because I didn't want to lose what we had." He moved closer, his forehead nearly touching mine. "I don't have all the answers. I'm still figuring this out. But nothing about this feels wrong. Not with you." His fingers touched my face again, tracing lightly along my jaw. And then, slowly, carefully, he leaned in. Our lips met. Not with hunger, not with certainty, but with something deeper. Something quiet and trembling and real. It wasn't perfect. It was nervous and hesitant. Breath caught between touches, lips brushing, pausing, coming back together like a secret being said for the first time. His hand slid to the back of my neck, holding me there like he didn't want to let go. I kissed him back with everything I had been holding for years, every stolen glance, every buried feeling, every ache I had trained myself to hide. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads stayed pressed together, our breath mingling in the small space between us. Jake smiled, soft and scared and open. Whatever this is, I want to find out. With you. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't dreaming. The morning air bit harder than it had the day before, as if the entire forest had turned brittle overnight. I woke up first, still half-pressed, against Jake, his hand no longer on me but close enough to remember it had been. For a long time, I didn't move, just listened to the soft rustle of trees, the distant call of birds, and the silence between us that felt suddenly too loud. When Jake stirred, he didn't say anything. He just sat up slowly, ran a hand through his hair, and crawled out of the sleeping bag like we hadn't shared something huge in the dark just hours ago. By the time I joined him by the fire, he was already tending to breakfast. Eggs cracked into a tiny pan, instant coffee steaming in a tin mug. He didn't look at me when he handed me my cup. Just mumbled, "Careful, it's hot," and sat down across from me. I sipped the coffee, the silence stretching and stretching. My chest was a knot. He hadn't said anything. No morning after jokes, no teasing, no eye contact. And all I could think was, he regrets it. I picked at my food, appetite gone. He barely touched his. The fire popped between us like it was mocking the quiet. Then finally he spoke. His voice was rough, low. "Can we talk?" I looked up, unsure whether I wanted to hear what was coming. But I nodded. He rubbed his palms together, eyes locked on the flames. "I don't regret last night. The breath I didn't realize I'd been holding left my chest in a rush. I'm scared," he admitted, eyes flicking to mine. I don't know what this makes me, but it felt real, it felt good, and I don't regret it." I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "But I need time," he said. "Time to figure this out. I'm not saying I can be who you need right away, and I don't want to mess you up while I try to figure out who the hell I am, but I don't want to lose you, not after this." The look in his eyes was raw, vulnerable. I saw fear there, but also something else. Hope, maybe. "You're not losing me," I said softly, "but I can't be just your secret." He nodded slowly like he understood more than he could say. The storm between us didn't break, but maybe, just maybe, it had started to clear. Back home, everything felt different, even though nothing had changed. The streets were the same. My apartment looked exactly like I'd left it. Slightly messy, a couple dishes in the sink, laundry half done. But I moved through it all like a ghost. I went back to work, met friends for drinks, answered emails. And yet, my mind kept drifting to a quiet tent under cold stars, to Jake's hand on my chest. His voice in the dark, that kiss. We texted, occasionally, nothing heavy. A meme here, a "you see this headline?" There. Just small talk. But every message was laced with the weight of what we weren't saying. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. And every time it was, I hoped this would be the moment he said something real again. But it never came. I told myself to let it go, that I'd been right to keep my distance all these years. That even now, after everything, he was still figuring himself out, and I couldn't hang my heart on maybes. But still, I checked my phone every morning. Still, I thought about the curve of his jaw as he whispered that he didn't regret it. Week passed. I had just gotten home from work, shoes still on, jacket half off, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it, and there he was, Jake. He looked tired, eyes shadowed, hair messy, hoodie half-zipped like he'd thrown it on in a rush. His hands were stuffed in his pockets like he didn't trust them to stay still. I couldn't stop thinking about it, he said before I could speak. About you. About that night. I just stared at him. The hallway light buzzed overhead. I've been trying to go back to normal, he went on, stepping inside when I moved aside. But I can't. I keep seeing you when I close my eyes. I keep hearing your voice. I've never felt like that with anyone before. I swallowed. Jake. He turned to me, eyes shining with something close to fear, but also something stronger. I don't have it all figured out, but I know I want to try. For real. Not just in the dark. Not just when it's safe to pretend it's a dream. I exhaled slowly, heart thudding in my chest. You're sure? He stepped closer. No, he admitted, smiling weakly. But I'm sure I want it to be you I figure it out with. That broke something open in me. The ache, the waiting, the fear. All of it softened under those words. I didn't say anything. Just reached out and took his hand. We sat down on the couch, our fingers laced together. No labels, no answers, just us, sitting in the quiet, hearts full of something that felt like hope.